Now that's about the last sound in the world you'd expect to hear in Philharmonic Hall, isn't it? Sounds more like your next-door neighbor's radio or the Newport Jazz Festival. And yet, that's a sound that's been coming more and more often into our American concert halls ever since American composers began trying about 40 years ago to get some of the excitement of natural jazz feeling, American feeling, into their symphonic music. Even so, in spite of these tries at combining jazz and symphonic writing, the two musics have somehow remained separate, like two streams that flow along side by side without ever touching or mixing, except every once in a while. But it's those once in a whiles that we're interested in today, those pieces in which the jazz stream now and then does sneak over to the symphonic stream and for a moment or two flows along with it in happy harmony. And these days, or at least for the last 5 years or so, there's a new movement in American music actually called the third stream. Now, the leading navigator of this third stream, in fact, the inventor of the phrase third stream, is a young man named Gunther Schuller. Mr. Schuller writes music of all kinds. He conducts it, he lectures on it, and he plays it. And certainly, he owes some of his great talent to his father, a wonderful musician who happens to play in our orchestra. We are very proud of Arthur Schuller. But young Gunther Schuller, who's still in his 30s, is now the center of a whole group of young composers who look to him as their leader and champion. And so I thought that the perfect way to begin today's program about jazz in the concert hall would be to play a piece by Gunther Schuller, especially this one particular piece, which is an introduction to jazz for young people. It's a sort of Peter and the Wolf of jazz. And like Peter and the Wolf, it is written for orchestra with a speaker. And it also tells about a young boy named, of all things, Peter. One thing is different, though. It calls for a symphony orchestra that also includes a jazz combo. And that's why you see over there 5 very distinguished young stars of the jazz world: Richard Davis on double bass, Don Ellis on trumpet, Benny Golson tenor saxophone, Eric Dolphy alto saxophone, and Joseph Cocuzzo on drums. And now, because Mr. Schuller is such a fine conductor as well as a composer, I have invited him to come and conduct his piece himself. And I will step down and become the speaker, taking my orders from him. So without any further explanation, here is Gunther Schuller's third stream composition, Journey into Jazz, with a narration written by the well-known jazz critic Nat Hentoff. And here is Gunther Schuller himself. This is the story of Peter Parker, a boy who learned about jazz. When he was still quite small, Peter Parker had strong musical tastes. When his father sang, Peter moaned. And when his mother sang, Peter howled. By the time he was 5, Peter had his own toy trumpet. At 6, he was given a phonograph that was as small and sturdy as he. And at 7, a transistor radio was added to help satisfy Peter's huge hunger for music. One day, Peter taped a bold sign outside the door of his room, which said, "Music is being made. Do not enter." The door was then closed. And from that day on, the sign appeared and remained in place from 3 to 6 every afternoon. From behind the door, Peter's parents could hear the trumpet or the phonograph playing Prokofiev, or the radio playing Rossini, and usually all three at once. Of course, the trumpet was the loudest. Soon Peter had a real trumpet and a real teacher whose tastes in music were as strong as Peter's. Peter's parents began to hear scales. First simple scales that soared slowly and floated back down again, sometimes stumbling on the way. Then more and more difficult scales that climbed quickly and fell with dizzying speed, and soaring arpeggios. From exercises, Peter went on to play real tunes, tunes that sometimes sounded like a small stream in a great hurry, or sometimes like a deep and peaceful river, or an electric storm, or something like nothing Peter's parents could imagine at all. Peter told his parents that these very advanced tunes were called modern music. They nodded, but were not quite sure they understood. Soon, Peter and his teacher began to play duets. Gradually, it became difficult to tell Peter apart from his teacher. And by the time he was 14, Peter was a most accomplished and exceedingly proud trumpet player. There was no music printed that he couldn't read. One summer afternoon, although the sign was on Peter's door and he was not disturbed, he couldn't concentrate. Somewhere in some other house nearby, a small jazz band was playing. And leading all the other instruments was a tenor saxophone player who sounded more daring and full of surprises than any musician Peter had ever heard. Peter was curious, and he was disturbed. Peter took his trumpet, left his room, followed the sound, and discovered 4 young men in the garage of a house on the next block. Seeing his trumpet, the young musicians asked Peter to join them. Peter looked and looked again, but nowhere could he see any printed music. He tried to join in with them, but something was terribly wrong. Peter could not find a place for himself. Every time he tried, the music would simply sputter to a stop. It just didn't fit. Look, the tenor sax man told him, you know your way around that horn all right, but you don't know jazz. When you do, come back again. We'll be around. Peter sadly trudged home, but he had been excited by the music he heard in that garage. So he began to listen to jazz records, especially records which featured trumpet players. And soon he was having fun trying to play some of his classical pieces in jazz time. Peter also began to realize that each jazz trumpet player had his own way of playing. It was almost like people talking with growls and slides and funny in-between notes. He also discovered the fun of different sounding mutes. Peter Parker felt ready, he ran to the garage of the house on the next block. When he started to play with the other young musicians, there was still something terribly wrong. He just didn't fit. Whatever he tried, the result was the same. Peter's horn stuck out as if he were all alone. He still couldn't find a place for himself. The others seemed to be having a conversation, but when he started to blow, it was like another language. He looked at his trumpet. Nothing was wrong with it. And he looked at all the other players, and they were shaking their heads. Look, the tenor sax man told him, you know how to play jazz on the trumpet now, but you don't know how to play with people. When you do, come back again. We'll be around. Peter sadly trudged home. He thought and finally realized that on all the records he had heard, he'd been listening only to the trumpet player and not to what the other musicians were doing. So Peter began to listen to his records in a new way. He learned about blending with other instruments. He learned about improvising counter melodies, tunes that fitted in with the solos other people were playing. You see, up to now, Peter had been playing along with his records, on top of the music, but now he tried to get inside the music until he felt as if he were part of the conversation. And little by little, he became a living part of every record he played. And now, once again, Peter felt ready. And he returned to the garage in the house on the next block. And this time, when he started to play with the other young jazz musicians, he thought he fitted in perfectly. But after a while, the other musicians stopped, and they stared at him mournfully. Look, the tenor sax man said, you know everything except what to say in the music. You and that trumpet make a fine machine, but jazz isn't a machine. Jazz is how you feel. What do you feel? When you know, come back again. We'll be around. Peter sadly trudged home. At first he was puzzled. But little by little he began to be angry. He ran home and looked fiercely at that sign on his door that said, "Music is being made, do not enter." He rushed to his room, slammed the door, grabbed his trumpet, and began to play. The first notes were full of rage, raw and ugly. But for some strange reason, playing those notes made Peter feel good. He looked at the trumpet and he thought, these are my notes. This music is me. And as the hours went by, the angry notes turned into triumphant notes. And then into happy notes. and all kinds of notes, filling the room. And all of these notes are mine, Peter said. These notes are how I feel. And that day, Peter was really ready. Now he went back to the garage on the next block. And this time, when he started to play with the other jazz musicians, he knew right away that he belonged. Played together for a long time, full of the pleasure of just making music. Now Peter was listening to the tenor sax man. Now he listened to the alto man, a whole other style. And Peter thought, hey, all this music is us. Jazz is people. That night, when Peter Parker returned home, he made a new sign and put it on his door. It said, "Music is being made. Come on in."